at as it relates to pulling together your pre-feasibility information. So basically, we're going to just cover 3 areas today. Again, we're going to review the frameworks and tools for project development. We're going to describe inputs for project information for the project information memorandum. And also then we're going to talk about country and government issues that need to be addressed. Whether or not you're doing a project with the government or it's totally private sector, there are always variables in a country, if it's not your home country, that you have to deal with, and we'll talk about those because these are details that you can actually begin to pull together even in the very early stages of the project. So, and not necessarily really get it out of the way because some of the answers obviously you won't be able to pull all of that together. But again, the idea is that you do as much as you can as early as possible in this process. So let's just again review our framework. First is our what we call our content and context framework. And again, we don't get into detail, but one of the things that we have found, really the project development process is similar to creating a product or a service. But project development is different in many cases, is that it's very complex because you have a lot of variables. So really what our framework is providing you an additional level that you can look at the complexities of a project. That's why we break it down into more detail because, again, people who are not familiar with all of the aspects and have a lot of experience, they really don't understand all of the different nuances and the different pieces that it takes in order to put something together. So what we're trying to do is ensure that you have that framework. So again, we have 22 categories. We will be going through those in more detail over the next several weeks. Not starting next week, but a few more weeks down, we'll start going into those into a deeper dive. The other instrument, and again, you can't really see this. I'm just putting it up as a sample, but is our analysis and impact matrix. And basically, what that allows you to do is pull out the critical information from all of those 22 categories and keep it on one sheet so that you can kind of track what's going on with each of the different areas, and and basically raise the what we call it the transparency for you and your team about what's going on the project. And then, I introduced the project development process. And, for many of you, if you've been working on projects, even if you're not in energy, you really kind of understand this process. The first thing is that you come up with an idea, you develop a concept, and then you prove that concept, and then you refine it, and then you commercialize it. So the process really isn't too much different with project development, and people will probably have different terms, not terms, but, their own structure of how to explain the project development process, and that's totally fine. Even what we're teaching you and showing you, you certainly can adapt and change and work with your own project management and project development processes. You're going to find that this is really quite flexible. Okay, so where are we in the process? I just took a closer snapshot. And so what we've done up until this point is we've talked first about, getting commitments at least, to try and get people on board. And the first thing that I pointed out is that you need a project definition document. You need to be able to give some technical information, some legal regulatory information, environmental, and those types of things so that you can start having discussions with groups about how to get the project done. And so, some might call this a scoping document. That's totally fine, but this is relatively high level. It's not really even necessarily, it doesn't talk about the actual finances. It may talk about financial policy, for example, what your approach would be and what you have to be concerned about, but it doesn't get into the business model. Where you get into the business model, and this is what we covered last week, was the concept document. Now, again, I'm trying to also align with other terminology. Some people might call it the business case. And so it's the same thing. Basically, you have to show how this project is going to be viable and how all the pieces fit together. And again, this document is not detailed, but it does show that you've done research. And basically, then you would have gone around and, looked at the environment, looked at the stakeholders, looked at the potential customer, the problem, the solutions, all of that, and then documenting what that business model would be. So that actually does require some research. But what's good at this stage is typically it's not, doesn't necessarily have to be extremely time intensive. And nor is it necessarily cost intensive. Of course, if you're doing it in another country or another region of the country and you don't have someone local to collect data, then yes, it can be expensive. And also depending on the energy source, for example, there might be some requirements. But one of the great things, if you understand what you're supposed to do at the very beginning, looking at the end and saying, what does it take to get to the end? Then you can figure out these things and you can manage the process better. So that's really what we're trying to establish. What is all this information? What are all the pieces that it takes to make this bankable so you get it financed? One of the disconnects that happens that I see very often is I see technical teams, they've technically proven the project, and in general it has the financial viability as well. But the problem is that the whole project is not structured to align with the financing mechanisms, and so they kind of get caught, what we call a catch-22. They kind of get caught in the middle, and they can't seem to get around the impediments. So the point is that to really look at these things very early on and decide how you're going to handle them. Again, it's no guarantee, but the idea is that you can plan and then you can adapt as you need to adapt. And so those two documents, again, bring down each time you go from one level to another, it gives you more detail. So again, stressing that this is really an iterative process. Now, even though, for example, I have steps here, project definition, concept document, pre-feasibility assessment, and actually the whole process is very iterative. So, for example, just giving you a few of the parts, you need to have acquired the site, you need to have a power purchase agreement, you need to get your permits, your interconnection agreement, you need to have, dialogue with key stakeholders and their agreements, and it has to be in writing. And so all of these different variables will develop at a different pace. And so, you're literally, iterating every single time you get something, anchored, you get something tied down. So, what I'm saying here is that even though we have these stages and we have these steps, note that the process is really iterative. You will probably have a project definition document that, hopefully is just decent so you can begin the process and begin to talk to people about, how to, bring them on board or access resources. The concept document, in all truth, you might actually have 2 or 3 iterations of that, just until it's tight enough so that people can see that, there's, something to the project. Now, again, remember I told you, in terms of when can you define your idea as a project, the first thing is having a site. If you don't have a site, almost everyone will tell you you don't have a project. So again, that is one of the key priorities that you have to look at is how to get that. So, and the reason that I say this is, I'm working with several different groups in terms of, people who want to develop projects in Africa. And many of them, for example, are diaspora. They're living in the United States, they're living in Europe, and so they have an idea and they have the connections locally. But what they still don't seem to understand is they can't understand how they're not getting traction. They're not getting traction because they don't have a site. They have a technology. They might have, some other people working with them. They have local people who can collect information, but they cannot drive it in order to get the site. And without a site, there is no project. And so, again, these are just reminders in reviewing that is, the key element that you have to, tap into is getting that site. So once you have the concept document, you can really begin to have some decent discussions with different groups. You can talk to financial institutions. They're not going to make you many promises. They're not going to, but at least you can consult with them to say, okay, I have this project, is this the type of project you like? Is it something you can work with? What are your requirements in order to get funding? So you can start having conversations. And the other thing is that it's important as you're going through this process, and we'll talk about it when we talk about stakeholder management and partnerships, is to develop those relationships early. If this is the first time or the first couple projects that you're doing in a country or in a local region, creating those right relationships very early on is very important. So again, these are just reminders just to make sure that you are understanding where you are in the process and what you need to do at that point. Okay, so then what I put together, and this is really the construct for pulling together the concept document. And some of you may have seen this in other sectors, something similar. It's called a business model canvas. We have our own name because we don't just include the center part, which is basically your business model, but we also include, in environmental factors, stakeholders, ecosystems, and the like, because we think that, you need to have the picture of both your internal and your external. Now, that doesn't mean that you communicate all of this to your, people external to your team or your key partners, but, you need something that kind of keeps those things together for you. So, you're seeing all of those key issues and the framework for your project, both internal to your organization or your business model and the external, the more extended environment. Okay, so then we introduced this, and I'm not going to spend any time around this, but this is then another view, again, a more complex view when we talk about using the content and context framework. You do not have to use this. If you have enough space, like if you have a large wall, it's good because, again, you can keep sticky notes in every area that's impacting your project. You could even have different colors. For example, if it's a strength, for example, you can have green. If it's a threat or if it's a strength and opportunity, you can have green sticky notes. If it's a threat or a weakness, you can have a pink, pink sticky notes for red. And this basically just allows you to keep a high level view of those things. You don't have to use that. You don't have to use this to that extent. But what I find is it's good if you have a place to keep it up, because when people pass, they can always look at it. As information changes, it's very easy for the information to be changed. Okay. One just final note when we talk about this. Basically, when you're communicating externally, when you're having conversations with people, basically it's really the business model that they're going to first be looking at. So that is the container for your conversations. That is the most important part. However, if they find that they're interested, they will ask you things, well, what is the environment like? Okay, who are the key players? So the additional parts of the Stratos business model canvas, help you to do that. And that information really should be in your concept document or your business case, because those are things that are impacting how you shape your business model and see it work. Okay? So that's really it for our review. Again, I didn't want to spend too much time on that. I just wanted to pinpoint where we were in this process, because as you begin to deal with more and more detail, sometimes you can get lost in the detail. It's funny sometimes, when people are experts, it's just like in their head, and so they know where they are and they do it. But, for people who are starting out or who haven't done many projects, you can get swallowed up by the information. So basically, we're always going to go back and talk about, okay, where is this in the process? What makes sense at this stage versus another stage? Okay, so let's start talking about the inputs for the project information memorandum. And to be truthful, this can be a little bit confusing. I think it may depend on which region you're in, maybe even institutions. Typically, the information memorandum is what you give to lenders about your project, and it doesn't have much detail. In terms of, it's not like it doesn't have all of your feasibility content in detail. It's more of a higher level summary so they understand what the project is and the financial structuring. However, I've seen others where they're different documents that they call the project information memorandum, where they offer a lot of detail. So just note that the project information memorandum, which is also known as a PIM, you again have to really define what others mean by that. Okay, when it's called information memorandum for lenders, for example, it might actually be termed an offering memorandum. Okay, but basically what I'm trying to do is just give you the construct, and the part of looking at this in terms of pre-feasibility is basically looking at all of the things that you can pull together before you have to put major money into a full feasibility. And so the more information you collect and work with beforehand, the better off you are. Because most of you, that I know, and this is again just from my own experience, so you'll say, well, that's not us. If you have money to do your own full feasibility, it's totally great, okay? But the question is, how can you convince someone else to work with you or, put money into that project if you haven't done as much as you could do before the full feasibility? So basically that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the inputs so you understand all of the different pieces that are related to it. And there may be some others, okay? So this is a progressive process. So if you identify, some of that, then please let me know. Now, one of the things I just realized I did not give the slides to you. Let me do that now. And you can download this for yourself. And so let's go ahead and we'll take a look at the inputs. Okay, so again, some of these terms are going to be very familiar with you. We've already talked about them, but I'm actually going to go in a little bit more detail. Again, we're dealing with, in this series of sessions for the next several weeks, we started with talking about the overall process. And so there's about 4 to 6 weeks of talking about the process and how to handle the process and the different elements. And then after that, then we are going to talk in more detail, about every piece and area to give you some best practices and insights in pulling all of these different pieces together. Okay, so the first thing is that when you're looking, these are just areas that you have to pull together basically for the final product. Okay, I'm not telling you that you just pull it together for the feasibility. The idea is, because you will understand that all of these different areas have to be covered, you can begin to investigate how you get them covered, how you address them, and then you can begin the work to do that. Now, depending from country to country, different countries have different processes. So, for example, in some countries, I think Kenya and I can't remember, but they're different countries. You can actually get begin to negotiate on a power purchase agreement maybe earlier. It's not the actual power purchase agreement, but you can get some of the particulars worked out if you've got enough. Even with pre-feasibility, it's basically, a high-level agreement. It's not like official, meaning that, you have it and it's signed off, but it's like a letter of intent, essentially, that, they're in agreement with you that this is what it'll look like. Okay, so the off-taker and customer, as I mentioned before, basically, if you're looking at project finance, and even I think to a great degree with investors in the current landscape, they're really looking for an off-taker agreement, which simply means that the financial viability of the project is based on the credit and credibility of the off taker. So obviously, if it's government and the project is guaranteed by a sovereign government, it's easier to get financing for it. So projects like in Kenya or in South Africa and many of the others, no matter what the details of their actual process, basically they all need more power. And so they have mechanisms to purchase power from what you guys will be, or your team, independent power producers. And so that means that would come with a sovereign guarantee. You also, very good projects in Africa are those with companies, private companies that need the power, like manufacturing facilities, large commercial locations that need power and may need, for example, off-grid power, not connected to the grid, in order to, keep running, for their productivity. So there are plenty of opportunities with off-takers. The harder projects are the ones where it's retail, where it's end users, like, just the general public, or even if it's kind of a business space, it's more, open market. And so those are tougher, and basically you need a much stronger market analysis in order to, get the right financial modeling for that. So, it's not, some people, when they look at projects that they've done in the past, maybe, they didn't have to do an off-taker agreement. But I think, many of the things that are making the renewable energy sector move is, variations of feed-in tariffs, in the United States, different places. Obviously that's what really kicked in South Africa's renewable energy, and also Kenya. Again, they're not necessarily using the same dynamics, but basically, mechanisms that make it easier to contract, or I should say make it more transparent and a direct way of contracting with, with off-takers. And so that's really, opened up many opportunities. And again, there are, again, Africa has 54 countries. Many of them are looking at how they can do that. There are others who are already on their way. And so, so again, especially if it's your first or second project, unless you're doing something, you have a really specific mission or a specific way of doing something, always, my advice is to try and find an off-taker. That will just really bolster your project. It's not that you can't offer services to others, but finding an initial primary off-taker that, purchases enough to make the project viable and make the lenders and even the equity investors feel confident about the project. Okay. Another thing is obviously the energy source. I'm not going to spend much time on that because, that's obvious. You need to, work out what your source is and the technical aspects of that. Power purchase agreement, I think that's also obvious. Basically, you need to be able to contract with the government. The thing that I would say at this point is that this is a good indication. We're going to spend time in the next section talking about looking at country and government issues that you should be addressing. And this is a good one. The rules for getting a power agreement. What are the policies? What's the history? South Africa has a very formalized way of doing that now, both for small and large scale. If you are doing it, in the open tender process, basically South Africa every year for small power supply, they are doing 100 megawatts, every year for the next 6 to 7 years, at least through 2020. For large scale power, I can't remember the dynamics, but, it's still quite big. And so essentially right now, they're still, offering rounds every year for projects to be developed. And so their process is very formalized. Kenya also, other countries. And the reason I keep mentioning these two primarily is because that's where we have people based and where we're working on, projects that are, further down the chain. And so, but then, when you look at site acquisition, and we will again bring this out in more detail when we talk about the country factors. But site acquisition is not necessarily that simple. When you look at doing it in the United States, basically, oftentimes I'm going to look at private land and negotiate, for the use of that private land. And in Africa, in many countries, foreigners cannot own property, or it may be limited. Even locals may own or may not own property. Indigenous nations may have rights to that land, and or the government may own it. So site acquisition can be more complex. And so this is, again, because the site is so key to your project, this is an area that you really need to understand and, get straightened out as soon as possible, your understanding and also acquiring the site. Again, the interconnection agreement, if you're doing it on-grid, you need to have, agreement that says that the utility, or whatever the entity is going to, connect. Because what happens is, if you don't have that interconnection agreement, you could have built that plant all you want. Or I'm saying you could, have developed your project, it's packaged nicely, everything will work, you just need the interconnection agreement. Okay, that becomes a problem because you can't get to financial close. All of these elements become, very important in the process. And I can give you a very good example in South Africa. I mean, basically when you, have tenders, you got the government, you get the power purchase agreement from Eskom. Essentially, what's in that, and I don't know if there's a difference in a physical document, but is the idea that you're going to be interconnected to the grid. Well, right now, South Africa is kind of backlogged. So their fourth round, they're now in the fourth round. And as people are starting to bring projects on from other rounds, Eskom is not actually able to really give them definitive information about interconnection. So that means that, projects are having trouble getting to financial close. So all of these variables become very important. And again, you want to keep this in mind from the very beginning and track all of these important elements. There can be an instant shift that totally changes the dynamics of your project. And so it's important to keep, keep all of these things at the forefront, at a level where you can say, okay, what's going on with that? Okay, I know that this is on track, this is off track. And at the very end, we'll talk about a, what do we call it? We call it, it's a no-go, no-go platform. But basically, you'll be able to indicate, whether it's green, whether it's yellow, whether it's red, and what are the issues that are holding it up, so that you can keep track of these different elements. Also, too, what often happens is when you're developing a plant, and it may not be like for renewable, but there can be issues of industrial water that need to be handled. The disposal of that industrial water, what do you do with it? Particularly like in a place like South Africa, because they've become they call themselves a green country. And so also, again, depending if it's not electricity, but, if you're doing combined heating and cooling, and some of these other factors, you may have cooling water and discharge. Utility service, sometimes you need to have sewer connection, for example. So there are all of these different little things that you can lose track of. Okay. So then there are permits. And again, we're going to get more into detail about what that looks like, but let me just mention some of them. Okay. So, obviously you would have your site permit. You probably are going to need a building permit, water permit, wastewater permit. If you're in a wetland, you're going to need wetland permits. And again, some countries may not actually have this worked out in a very methodical way. But, for example, they might be in agreement with international agreements that essentially say that they're going to protect the environment. Okay, so even if they don't have the internally, they don't have all of that stuff worked out, they're still accountable. Now, many of the countries, they may not necessarily say that you cannot build and you cannot do it in this way. But the thing is much of the finance for for renewables is really coming outside of Africa. South Africa might have quite a bit of its own, but even there, it's a lot of foreign investment. And so essentially, if you're dealing with an international bank, an investor outside of the continent, they all have, they're abiding by pretty tight environmental issues or compliance because they don't want to be caught in a project that has an issue with the environment. And so where it may seem, like if you're in Africa and you're in a country that this doesn't seem to be a major issue, it is when it comes to financing. And so this is a very good example of how, if you're not aware of all of this, right, and all of these different factors, when you come to finance, you can find out that you have not been structured correctly in order to get the finance, even if overall your project looks feasible. Okay. And so, it's very important, again, to keep track of all of these pieces. Okay. And so then we also talked about, and I keep talking about stakeholders and about the community. In Africa, in fact, even in the United States, a lot of these lands can be on like indigenous lands. In the United States, Canada, we call them Native Americans or First Nations. And so in Africa, they have very much the same thing. There are tribes that have land that basically has been passed down through generations. And so there's typically in a country a combination of tribal lands and government-owned lands, even when there's not a whole lot of private ownership. So typically, in order to facilitate a project at the level of the site, you're going to be dealing with, indigenous nations. And so that's a whole nother issue of culture. Many of these nations may not actually have the capacity to navigate how to put up an energy project and the different dynamics. So as the project developer, you then have, quite a bit of responsibility to work with the community, to work with the government. And so in Africa, whereas maybe in other places in the West, and this is really true of all developing regions, that's not just Africa, but the point is that the burden of putting all of this together typically falls more heavily on the developer. Now, what's great, and I don't know if I announced it last week, but we're working with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and they actually have done quite a lot of work with indigenous nations in Alaska. And so they have worked with the community, and in many cases, the community is actually leading the renewable energy project initiative. And so when we start talking about community interface in a few of the later sessions, we'll actually have a few case studies from them, and we'll also hopefully be able to, bring them into the mix, and they'll talk about their own experiences. And then I'll also bring one or two other people throughout the process to talk about how they're dealing with stakeholders and, all these different pieces throughout the process. So community stakeholder relations is important. You cannot, in a developing region like Africa, you cannot get around working with the community. And even if it's not over the land, over the site, all of the African countries have development issues. They want more economic development. They want more inclusive, broad-based. So they will begin to, even if it's not formally written, in any legislation per se or any program, that is an expectation that when you come into the country that you will be doing something within the community. Now, some I don't hear it as often anymore because I think companies are getting used to it, whether they like it or not. But, before I was getting a lot, well, we don't have to do that in the United States. We don't have to, and, I've heard this. And yes, you actually do. Okay. It may not be legislated. It may, or it is legislated. So like when you go to a state and they give you an investment bundle, tax breaks and deferred tax holidays and all of that. Okay. That's typically tied to creating jobs, which is a community thing. It's tied to maybe skills development. And then in a more broader sense, you want to have a good reputation. You want to be a member of that community. So you do social things. So it's really no different. The fact that someone's demanding that you do it in the language that they may demand it in Africa may make you feel like, oh, well, I'm not going to do that. But in actuality, as a company that wants to grow, that is just something that's a part of what you have to do. And this is a real interesting thing I was reading. I for such a long time, I had a hard time understanding why in the world, anyone would not really understand the importance of the factor of key stakeholders. The community and elsewise. And I think it is a cultural shift that's going on. But basically now, in several different reports that I've read, they're saying that, companies still haven't necessarily quite gotten it, but now you have to address that whole stakeholder thing. It's not just about your shareholders. It's about the whole spectrum of stakeholders. And so as a project developer or project sponsor, even a government, or in a financial institution, you're concerned about that. You may not actually be handling that aspect, but you are ensuring that those things are done, because if it's not done correctly, it can be a risk to the project. And everything that we're talking about here, if it's not done correctly, and the structure is not there appropriately, can become a risk that financial people and investors do not want to get into. Okay, so now we're looking at the engineering, procurement, and construction contracts, and that's the EPC. And, again, unless you have an existing relationship with an EPC, it can be difficult to get that in writing as a commitment. They basically, EPCs, and again, it's coming from the fact that I'm not an expert in the before I wasn't an expert in the energy sector process. So I kept asking, well, why is it so difficult? Why are we getting so many issues with EPCs? And really what it is if you look from their perspective, when they're working on many of these projects, their profit margin is really not that great. And so, when they come on board, they are trying to be very efficient. So they like to come in when the feasibility is done or when the design has been done, and then, flush out plan and for construction, doing the engineering, doing the procurement. That's their forte. Okay. It's all right to say to a company, okay, I have this project, but most of them are not going to be necessarily interested in the project until you get, basically, really well into your feasibility. Unless you have some type of strategic partnership with them and you've developed relationship. Maybe if you, I have seen, not necessarily with an EPC, but there are groups that really want to do something in Africa and they want to figure out a market, so they're going to be more willing, to do that. And so, you can develop relationships early. Again, that's what we do, around our business model. And it does work, and it helps a lot because then you can get a lot done and get projects developed. However, just in general, it's a very hard sell to an EPC when you only have a project definition or even a concept document. Basically, they really want more detail. But you also have to then recognize the importance of the EPC. Basically, if you don't have an EPC, the financial people can look at the project, but if you don't have your EPC that, is proven, it's just like with technology. You need the technology, you need the EPC, and unless the EPC is proven, again, your project actually just kind of sits until that's resolved. You can also have fuel supply and transportation contracts. This is obviously for projects like, biomass. For example, if you're collecting local biomass, if you're collecting waste, there's going to have to be a means of, acquiring that or securing that. So that is often called the feedstock agreement. But then attached to that also then is having the transportation costs. And of course, a good example is transportation. You need the contract for the PEM, but in terms of making a project viable or non-viable, if you have feedstock that's far away from the site, that can add extremely high transportation costs, particularly in Africa, which can really affect the ROI on the project. In some cases, you will also have agreements as it relates to water and wastewater discharge. Other things that you need to figure out is equipment. That's the technology. Could even be construction equipment, because in some countries they may not have all of those different pieces. So basically, you need to begin to look at what equipment you're going to use in order to do your project. Now, with those things, you can actually, again, look at doing those early. I think many of the developers that I've talked to, basically they've figured out the technology, and they've kind of done the design of the plant and the value stream or the value chain in order to to do the power. But again, the earlier in the process you have this information, the better off you are, because again, it's showing to people who you're trying to bring on board. It's not just the financial people. Remember, stakeholders are the ones that get your project where it needs to be, because people or institutions have either the resources or the capital or the people power or the equipment in order to help, or relationships with others in order to help the project, be viable. And so, when we're talking about the process, any of these things that we're talking about, under it is always the stakeholders. And this is one key important lesson, particularly in Africa, any developing region, is that relationships are paramount in working through this. This does not mean that, they're your life buddy, but having personal relationships, professional relationships, where you're supporting one another in order to get it done. Again, a misconception or a myth is that does not happen in the United States and other places. It's just, a transactional. That is not the key. I mean, we're in the middle of the Charlotte Energy Cluster, and I can tell you it is relationship, okay? These companies work together and they support one another. They know one another. If you know 4 or 5 institutions and you're in the middle of that mix, then you are among all of the key players of the Charlotte Energy Cluster. I mean, so that's, 4 or 5 key institutions on one hand, and that is what you're going to also find in any country in these energy clusters, is that they're probably 4 or 5 key institutions. Now, there might be more individuals, but if you are in the dynamics in the middle, you can see things get done faster because there's relationship. And it's totally transparent. It's not stuff under the table. But for example, instead of your project being at the bottom of the list, you can say, okay, well, I need to know this information. Can you tell this to me real quickly? Don't want to take much of your time, but am I in the right direction? Okay, I do that all the time with the financial institutions that I look at. What work with? What, can you just tell me, is this something you look at? What's missing? And, for you. And I get a response, and I typically get it quickly because I'm not asking them really to do any work. I'm just asking them to do a quick scan. And then that tells me, okay, we need to, work on that. So I don't go to them and ask them to give me a detailed review. I basically just get them to give me some initial feedback, and then I go back and I work on that business model, or I work on what's missing, and then I tell them when I have it together, I'll come back to you. I do not bother them with anything and bring it back to them until I've done what I've said I'd do, unless there's an additional question. So this whole process of working through these early stages there's a lot of soft issues and relationships issues that you have to do. So everything that we see here is supported by how you handle the stakeholders. And how you handle the stakeholders can either increase cost project development or reduce it. Remember now, it's not always the amount of money that you put out, but it could be the amount of money that you're losing in terms of time. Again, the reason for this workshop is so that people understand the different dynamics and they can learn about this early on in the process to manage time better so that they don't waste time and effort. Because wasted time and effort, again, that is a factor. Even though it's not the exchange of money, but your time and your effort is very important. And, with any project development, any venture development, any delays, increase the likelihood that your project might not get done. Okay, so what we're trying to do is tighten that up as much as what's within your control or influence by having having a systematic process and methodology that allows you to do that. Okay, so other things, organizational capacity, your technical team, internally, do you have all of the people that are necessary, like the manager of the company, the administrative staff? Oftentimes, again, with construction, that's the EPC, and also you'll have an operator for the plant. So basically, it's talking more about administrative, who is going to lead this? Who's going to lead this? Feasibility study, we will talk more about that in the next section, what that looks like. And for many of you who are technical, I won't be telling you anything you don't know. Again, remember that this course is basically for all key stakeholders, so they all begin to have a common framework of understanding. There's also the environmental impact assessment, and typically they actually, I don't know what the acronym is, but basically when you're doing the environmental, they also do a social impact assessment, so they're really done in tandem. You can also, depending on where you're at, which country or opportunity, you might actually be doing, instead of doing like a purchase power agreement, you may be doing a public-private partnership where the government, owns part of it, or, they give you the land, for example, for your execution, and so it might end up being a public-private partnership. In that case, typically what happens is, instead of the land agreement I can't remember, but that instead of, I think it's the land agreement, then you have the concession agreement that's more aligned with the public-private partnership. You also need to look at legal and regulatory frameworks. We've talked about that with the project definition. You also need to look at financing agreements. And again, this is not going to be until the late stages, but the idea is to understand everything that has to go into that final document or is input for it. It may not actually be in the final document, but it's all leading up to having a bankable project and communicating that to investors, other key partners that may come along, and also funders. You'll have insurance requirements. You have to have, insurance on the property. You have to have insurance on the equipment. All of that is de-risking the project for people who are a part of it, whether it's yourself, whether it's the investors. And then, of course, you have to have a process and key milestones, and you have to have it documented. And anytime you update a project information memorandum, you update where you are. So there's always a section that says status. And so, those are, that's a simple thing that you should be able to do. That's pretty obvious. You also often will need to have studies done on infrastructure and transmission to ensure that what's in the country or in that area, what you need so that you can do, like particularly with, on-grid connections, is there. And if not, for example, then you would have to have some type of agreement with the government or whoever the off-taker might be. For example, it could be a private company, that those things are put in place for you in order to do the project. And it's interesting, the thing is, you might miss these things yourself, okay, as a project developer. If you're not with a large firm, if you haven't done a lot of projects, you could miss some of these things. But the thing is the financial people won't. So that's why it's important to do this early so that you don't find this out at the very last minute. I mean, they're going to do their due diligence. They're going to look this thing over with a fine-tooth comb. And so, they're not going to miss it because it's pulling their money, okay? But the thing is, you don't want to be caught in a situation where you have not addressed every single area that is important to them. Okay, now I mentioned environment before. That was the assessment, but then of course there are going to be environmental compliance requirements. So, sometimes that can come in the form of permit, that you have to get clearance, if there's an endangered species, a village or whatever, and, there's certain things that you need to do not to disrupt, their way of life. You also need to obviously include your financial plan and your structure, your financial projections, and risk analysis. All of it's on you to show. The investor and, the funders and other key partners, they don't need to prove anything. It's up to you to present all of that information, and then they'll validate it and they'll do their due diligence against that. And then the other piece that we then will begin to magnify and unpack today is the country and government issues. Now, in many countries, you will probably be going into, because it seems to open up the market, is situations either where you are going in where you can become an independent power producer and supply power to the government, or you're going to supply power to industry, like I was talking about the private sector, like a manufacturing firm. And so that is where the market seems to be moving a lot of. There is, however, a huge cry for giving universal access in Africa to everyone in the rural areas, and just under many current models, it's just cost prohibitive. So, investors and funders are not typically going to look for that. But obviously, if it's a socially impactful thing, there are others through grants, through program-related investments, mission investments. They still expect to see sustainability, but some of their factors are different, and so you can still service some of those groups, but it's not necessarily as easy. There's already a lot of complexity in what we're talking about now, but there's more complexity when you even get to that. So basically, you have to consider, where you're going to sit yourself in order to get on the ground and get a project up. This is the thing I always advise. Try and find where you can get the lowest hanging fruit. Where can you get started and have success? And then once you have your ecosystem, you can then expand and do the things that you really want to do the way that you want to do it. The first thing is, for yourself and for others and partners that you're working with, is to get those initial projects executed. Once that's done, you have a lot more leeway in bringing others in order to, come alongside of you. And so the dynamics of working in, any developing region, again, is that there's a lot of complexity, a lot of uncertainty, not because there's a political problem, but there can be a lot of bureaucracy. There can be not strong institutions or not strong institutions in energy. They've been, many of the countries, most of the countries have been working that the utility was a public utility, okay? And they now don't have the money as a government to pay for what's needed for the growing population. And so now they're, being driven to private sector, and, and then they're going into now offering opportunities by selling, the power to the government. And so in any case, whether you are working directly with the government as an independent power producer or in private sector, there are still country and government issues that are going to impact your project. So let's take a look now at what Some of those are, and again, the reason I'm bringing this up now, when I talk about the inputs for the PEM in the pre-feasibility stage, is because you can actually, most of this, the questions that you want to address, basically can be answered at least from a knowledge perspective, not a specific thing, for example, like if you need an agreement, but you can understand what needs to be done in order to deal with all of the variables that it takes in the country working under a certain government in order to do your project. Now, one of the things that I will say is that you can do this one of two ways. There are, there's a lot of information on countries and governments, and when we go through the environmental analysis in detail, I'll give you several of those sites. But just to start, you can do doingbusiness.org, and actually I have to check the other one, but there's another World Bank IFC website that talks about investing. So, for example, it tells you about the land issues, and for example, we'll give you, if there's limitations of ownership in the energy sector. So there are many different sites and sources of information that you can do to pull that together. If you're going to countries like South Africa and Kenya and Tanzania and others, they actually have documentation from the government to explain what their process is in order to, provide power to the government. So there's a lot of free, available information to help you collect this information. And you can do this if you identified a country, for example, or a few countries during the idea stage. You can do that right away. You don't have to wait. And this is extremely important. Again, you might have the technology, you might have the site, but when you look at all the variables related to dealing with the country, for example, you're going to find that it might not be that project might not fit that environment. Okay, so this again is a win-win. You can get this done very early. Okay, so anyways, let's start. Then now breaking down the questions. What is the environment of the country? Okay, again, when we go to the section where we talk about the context, which is an environmental analysis, we'll look at the 12 different areas in detail about, what you can look at in a country. We've got a nice long questions list that you can use as a review tool or a checklist, not that you have to, collect all of that information. You also want to know, are there any other similar projects done in the country, particularly, I think, with renewables, like biomass? I'll give you a good example. In Kenya, there's an invasive species, and one of our clients is working with that as a feedstock, and they've come quite a long way. Well, it's not like it's not like, I don't know, I can't think of it, but another common biomass that you think of. And so, financial people or investors might want to know, well, where has this been done before? Where is the technology? And very fortunately, a big company actually just implemented a biomass plant using that invasive species in Kenya. And so now that can be a reference point for their project. And so you want to see and be able to contextualize as much as possible what's already been done in the country. What can we learn from that? You can sometimes go to other developers, not that, because often they'll see that there's plenty of opportunity, but, they'll be willing to sit down with you and have, a cup of coffee, to talk about, well, this is what I learned from this process. This is who you should go to. And so these are things that actually help, again, accelerate your project. Okay. If you're doing the project with the government, can you get a letter of intent? Again, this comes down to commitment. The more commitments you have, the stronger the project is. The first commitment, typically to make it a project, is the site. If doing with the government, can you get a master agreement, which means essentially that, they're giving you an agreement that says, through all stages, basically, from development all the way through, that you actually have a contract to do it. And, that you may be able to find in you may be able to find with public-private partnerships, not in the open bidding process, not until you've actually won, the tender. But the other thing is that when you're talking about a master agreement, then that is also, requiring that you have the capacity. And so, many governments now, they've worked with people where they've, done that and they've offered it. And, basically the people didn't come through. So now governments are getting savvier and they're saying basically, you have to prove that you can do this. And that includes bringing the finance. And so if you bring the finance, and you bring the technology, you bring all the pieces, then, what we're seeing now is that through public-private partnerships that, they will then execute that. But even now, many of the public-private partnerships are based on tenders, okay, or at least some type of bidding process in order to get it. So there is, more structure that's coming into place because of everyone's experience, whether it's been on the developer side, outside of the continent, inside of the continent. Now we're starting to see things tighten up quite a bit in the last 10 years. The other thing that should be noted is that in some cases, you might have to have special legislation required to do the project. In some of the countries that are, in what they call low LDCs, least developed countries, they might not have too much institutionalization. And so in order to make it investor friendly so that you can bring finance people along, they might have to create an investment framework and policy around the project. Now, obviously, if it's better if it's in place. Now, we're seeing that, across the countries, if you go to the doingbusiness.org website, you'll see that things are progressively improving in terms of getting the right frameworks so that investment will work both locally and also for foreign investors and developers. And I'll give you a really good example of this. It's not energy, but it's called the it's an economic opportunity zone. It's called First Step. It's in Sierra Leone. And it's basically an economic zone. It was the first one in the country, so it was very strategic for the country. They had no parliamentary legislation to support an economic zone. So the zone people brought together a ecosystem. They had legal assistance from D.C. attorneys who helped the parliament develop their economic zone policies, the investment frameworks, to make it attractive to get people to come into the country. And now, even though with Sierra Leone going through what they've been going through with Ebola, what we're seeing is we're seeing many projects coming into that economic zone, that economic opportunity zone, because they were able to establish the right legislation. So in some countries, you may find that in order to make it work, to structure the project, that it may require special legislation. And often that might be relevant to scale, for example. One of the things that I've found that in general, if you are serving a private interest, okay, you typically, the regulation around that is relatively open. So if you're doing a small scale project, for a mining company or, for a manufacturing facility, you still need permits, you still need to do things in the appropriate way, but it's not as much bureaucracy because the company basically, they've already got the facility, they've already got the site. There's just a lot of things. So that might even be another, open path that you can go into versus trying to go through the route of, working with the government. And there are many, foreign firms, from South Africa, for example, from the United States, from Europe, from Asia, who are going in who, want to have the power production. So if you can develop relationships with those in your own country, you can move where they move. There's a group that we're working with. They're in one location that we're working on. And basically they have, I think it's 19 different other countries that they're in. Okay. And so this is even a good way, a strategy of scaling into Africa is by attaching yourself to one or two companies that are actually planning to expand into Africa, and you end up being one of their service providers. And the great thing about that is two things. If they're doing all of that, then typically they are, a credit-worthy, a credit-worthy off-taker. Two, the thing is that they're going to need you. Okay, it's not, they need the energy, so it's not a want, it's a need. And so you become a very critical part of their process. Okay. Also, typically, these projects are going to be special purpose vehicles, SPVs. And so basically, depending on the country, you need to know what the best legal entity is for the project. Okay. You also want to know what the tax treaters are like. Again, if you are not a resident of the country, or if your investors are not, or your funders, they're going to want to know what are the tax issues, what are the finance issues related to that country. In some cases, for example, you might be taxed for your revenue in your country and then taxed when you bring it back into your country. So that's, double taxation. So you're going to want to look at, are there any double taxation treaties, between countries? You're also going to want to know what government commitments are to infrastructure. Again, infrastructure is lagging behind, and that can, in fact, impact your project. And so, again, I won't tell you where, but there's an example. Someone's building a manufacturing plant, and they plan to export. Part of the agreement with the government for bringing the manufacturing facility to the country is that they would build them a port or a berth so that they could export their product. Well, the government didn't actually do that, okay? And so now that manufacturing facility is going to be, working in operations in the summer, and they still don't have, a berth for the export. But of course, in this case, it's okay because their first market is the local market. But the point is that, again, if you need infrastructure from the government, if you need road access, if you need, the grid, the transmission lines to be extended further so you can interconnect, you need to know what government commitments in general there are to, what is their policy about if you're bringing power, are they saying that they're going to pay for that? And, even, for example, if they're saying they're going to pay for it, they might have identified where the logical places are where they can connect power to the grid. And so you might want to try and see if you can find your site around there, because by having that knowledge, you've already sped up the likelihood that you can get an interconnection agreement. Anywhere where your stakeholders, whether government or else, the less money they have to spend, the less resources they need in order to do a project, typically you're going to find that it's a little bit faster to get them to move on it because it doesn't really require much effort. Now, the difference is of course the significance of the project. If it's quite significant, okay, it's quite important, it's tied to something else that needs to happen, and again, energy is a good indicator, then, again, you're able to create momentum. So when you're working with your project as a developer or a sponsor, it's not just about the technical side. It's not even just about the community side. You have to be very strategic in order to make all of these pieces move together, because every stakeholder has a different motivation, okay? And you have to learn what that motivation is and be able to, cause them to move forward with your project. And so, again, you cannot, in Africa, succeed unless you are able to handle the many different dynamics, both the tangible and the intangibles and the soft side. So what helps you to be able to navigate with stakeholders is, one key aspect is understanding or showing that you've done your work. Okay? I've seen, again, I'm not working with, but people send people to me all the time, to help them come into Africa. And they've got a great technology solution. They got the capacity. And I said, well, what you need to do is you need to look and, find a site. We can help you do that, but you need to come to the country. You need to have an understanding, because in order to have discussions about working with these different, because everyone wants to work with government. I won't say everyone, but, I'm just giving some generalities or stereotyping. And so the problem is that they want to do that, but they have no local knowledge. And so they think just because they have the technology, even with finance, that it's just going to be easy to swoop in and do it. Now, the Chinese can do that, okay? I won't say anything against the Chinese, because I like Chinese people, but, they have their ways of doing things, okay? And they're really supported by government. So basically what they're doing is they're doing government-to-government agreements, and then the requirement of the finance from the government of China is that you use Chinese suppliers to a certain level. And so that's been a mechanism, and it's not a bad mechanism if it's used well and it benefits all stakeholders. It's not a problem. But, many people who are coming into Africa do not have that framework to work within. And so, you need to learn then how to navigate and work with these stakeholders in order to get them to move along on your project. Again, acquiring the plant site. How do you do that? That's very important. How do you go about getting the plant site zoned? If it's a rural area, they're obviously they haven't zoned it for energy. Okay, may not matter in some countries, but that would be an issue. In some cases, there are local requirements. They could require that you use local engineers for construction drawings. Countries, they're looking for you to have local partners. And so in some cases, even in ownership, in some countries, they look for you to have 20-30% ownership, local ownership. So you have to know factors before you, make a large investment into the project. Also, the government guarantee, that was the piece that I talked about as it relates to people being independent power producers for providing the power to government, because then it's basically, a sovereign guarantee. And for financial institutions, that's something that they really, they want the strength to know that they're getting their money back. And then also, what expansion rights would you have? If you've done one project, are you restricted in any way from extending that particular project, into more power? And we're looking at that more from not the technical side or financial side, but from, the government. Is there, for example, if it's related to land, if you're adjacent to an area, they plan to do something else and you want it to expand, is that, are you going to be restricted in the amount of land that you're able to acquire? And solar, that's a particularly important aspect, because, when you're dealing with solar farms, they're using actually quite a bit of land. Okay, so you also want to ensure that you can secure the raw materials, and again, that's like feedstock. And so again, you're going to have feedstock agreements. You want to know how you go about doing that. What are the import requirements for construction materials and equipment? That means that, in many cases, again, you're going to be importing materials to build the plant and facilities. And so one good example is you want to know if they're going to charge you customs duties for it. In many countries, it's part of their investment package that when you're bringing construction equipment into the country for the purpose of a project, you don't have any customs duties on it. And when you need to take it out, it's the same thing, because you're using it for a very specific purpose. It's not used for resale or for sale in the market. It's going to be the same thing, materials during operations and maintenance. What are going to be the duties affiliated with that? The other thing that you want to know, it's not really just about the duties, but you want to know the process. Some port operations can take a long time, in order to, get things through it. You need to understand, what you need to do, because if something happens, if there's a major piece, even if it's under warranty, and there's a major piece that, something happens and, God forbid, there's a fire in your plant or whatever, and you need to replace equipment, you need to know, how do we handle that? What laws, what regulations, policies, procedures will impact our ability to be able to do that. And again, these are all questions, detailed questions that, the investors and financial people will do in their due diligence. What is electrical power availability during construction? Okay, that should be obvious to you. How are you going to be able to construct the plant? You're developing an energy plant in a country that doesn't have enough energy. How is that going to impact you? What do you need to pull together to ensure that you have the right power for that? Okay, what are the weather factors that affect turbine performance? How do you handle wastewater disposal? What is the railroad and road access like for your project site, and even just to get, like construction equipment and other things, to the site? What freight taxes might be employed? What are the requirements for bringing in expatriate employees? Some countries do not want you to bring in a lot of expats, and they have rules for that. Now, it's probably not as restrictive, on a project, but when it comes to operations, it might be different. Oftentimes what companies will do is they will, get the EPC, they'll bring in, the manager, the EPC. The EPC will try to find local contractors and people to do work on the projects. And then the same thing, trying to find a local operator. And so these things, though, however, can also make or break the opportunity. What facilities are available for your expatriates? Depending on how, are they bringing families? Is there sufficient housing? Some of these projects may end up being in areas that are more rural, for example, and you may actually have to, figure out how you're going to accommodate the people who are working on site every day. And also, as I mentioned earlier, what is the availability of local workers? Okay. What trade unions exist? Okay, or any workers groups in the country. A very good example is, South Africa. South Africa is a very heavily labor union country compared to many other countries in Africa. And so, when Walmart came in, Walmart had to negotiate to satisfy requirements of the governments and the trade unions to be able to buy out, I think it was Massmart. And so, because they wanted to ensure that, Walmart, that people weren't going to lose jobs and other things. And so Walmart developed a suitable plan that they came into agreement with. Now, in other countries, you may not have trade unions, but you can have trade associations. So, for example, it might be like craftsmen, those types of things. So if you try to work around them, again, you might have difficulties, not necessarily at the government level, but just in the local marketplace, about getting things done. What are taxes and exemptions from taxes related to your project? What are the customs duties, the tax holidays? What skills development programs are available? Many people don't think about this, but because skills development is a very important part of development for the country, they may have incentives, they may have programs that actually help you. Some of these countries, for example, if not necessarily if you're doing energy production, I'm giving you examples that I'm familiar with, but for example, if they've developed economic zones and they've developed programs around them so that if you're going to put a manufacturing facility there, they will actually find and train, do the core, the basic training for the workers who will work in that plant, and they will pay for it. They will manage the process, and they'll do a certain level of investment in it. They won't do all of it necessarily. And so that's then something that you don't have to do. So you want to know those types of things. If they're requiring certain things, what are they able to provide you in terms of support and able to do it? And then, of course, you either want to know other government support programs that are available. You may find that they're doing some other programs that link to your project or can be linked to your project, and then you can access the resources that are available through those programs. Okay, sorry, long line of questions. But it's a very good example of all of the different elements that you really have to consider when you go into another country. And, and even if you're in the country, because you're going to end up bringing in most instances, some of your value chain is going to be regional or international. So many of these factors are still important for you to understand. How do you convert currency? Is there enough, for example, can, for example, if someone is in the country and they need to go, back home or whatever, are they going to be able to convert to, the dollar or the euro? I'll give you one example. I was, some of the clients that I've had in the past, they were purchasing things using us through the United States, and they were in Nigeria and they had plenty of cash, but they had to wait 2 or 3 days because their bank didn't have enough American dollars in reserve in order to transfer to make the wire transfer into the United States. So basically, you need to check those types of reserves, in the country and see what their pattern is. Also, and this is tied into pulling money from the country, but this is more from an investment perspective, the money that you make, are you able to, take it out of the country free and clear with no limitations? What is the availability of political risk guarantees? What protection is there against discrimination? If you're in the energy market, fortunately in energy, because there's not necessarily a lot of capacity in many of these countries, discrimination may not be really evidence unless there is local partners who are bringing other technical partners. But in competitive markets, you want it to be an open market, right? So you want to know, is there an issue with discrimination against foreign firms? What is its expropriation history? Have governments just taken over private industry, private projects? And again, you can get insurance against that, but you still, after all the work you put in and the profit that you might have made, you don't necessarily want to be dealing with a country who's going to do that to you. What arbitration recourse do you have? What are the arbitration, guidelines, or what structures do they work under? Will they allow you to put in your contracts an international arbitrator because you feel more comfortable, like a neutral place, like let's say the United Kingdom, where the local factors, the government, even local partners or whatever, they allow you to put arbitration outside of the country because it's more international and people are more comfortable with working with, arbitration institutions in the United States and Europe and in Asia. What social programs are you required to undertake? Again, as we were talking about community, you can't just go in and expect that it's just that the fact that you're providing energy that is going to make your project. They're going to be looking for how to leverage the government, the local people. They're going to be looking at how they can leverage that to do more, to meet service delivery, to increase economic development, to develop, to build schools, to build hospitals. Okay, so even small projects, depending on how they're configured, can have great impact on a community and in a country. Okay, so what about force majeure? What is the governing law of documents? Now, this is, for example, in Europe and the United States, in, Hong Kong, for example, when you do e-signatures, that's totally legal. Well, in some of these countries, they may be in agreement like in treaty internationally, but functionally it doesn't work that way. So you need to understand what is proof of, signature or agreement or authority. In some countries, for example, and I don't know if it's still the same in South Africa, but when I first went, you could not use a black pen. You had to use a blue pen to do your signatures, and then it's considered legal. So it could be something as small as that. So you want to understand, all of the rules and the regulations around contracting in that country so that can ensure that your contracts are solid. And this can be more of a procedural thing. It's not, related to anybody's willingness to agree or to be transparent. It's just the technical mechanics of handling contract and signing agreements and documentation. Okay. And then the last thing is, in some of these projects, you might actually find local investors and partners that are available. And whether or not that's the case or not, what are your requirements by the government to make that opportunity available to local investors and partners? Now, one of the typical scenarios with projects is that, and again, I'm not talking about, if you're talking about a 250, 300 megawatt plant, that's very large, okay? But let's say you're working anywhere from, 1 megawatt all the way through 30 megawatts, and it requires that you have investors. You might actually be able to find investors to bring in the equity. In countries like Nigeria, and in fact, many of these countries, there are a lot of people that have a lot of cash. And they may want to invest in some of these things because they see the long-term return on investment. So there are opportunities, I think, particularly in the equity investment, to draw some of the capital required on these projects from local investors. Now, that doesn't mean you'll get all 30%, but if you get 10%, that means that it's, then you only have to find another 20%. And so it's one of the things that, just as a trend, there's not as much local investment in projects, not just in energy. And so that's something that I think governments and others are trying to look at in order to get more local investment. But I think part of it is, and again, it's many of the people who make a lot of money in these countries, and it's cash, they actually are not, they're into trading, for example. They know their business, they do well, they're very good at making cash, but they don't really understand investment. And so this is the transition that has to be made, and things have to be packaged. It's just a whole different dynamic. But there's untapped opportunities in that. And I'm speaking related to Africa, but I can tell you that this is what's happening in China, for example. I mean, people have made money, the companies, the families have made money, but they have not really learned how to invest yet. And so now you have people who have cash and they want to invest. And so, they will come, they don't even understand all the dynamics of how to structure that investment and all of that and what to look for. They just have the cash. And so the idea is when if you get those opportunities, how can you set up mechanisms and even, refer those investors to someone who can help them structure it correctly, to help your project? Because you're going to find that as you do more projects in Africa, you're obviously going to need more equity. And equity, you're not typically going to get a project where they're going to say they're going to just pay you 100%, of debt. Or that there will be institutional investment. You need to have many different channels for finance and for investment. That even includes, beyond that, just in terms of funding, looking at grants, looking at, technical support that may actually, for example, you might be able to find an institution that will help you do the pre-feasibility because they have a development mandate for that country. And so you don't have to pay for it, in fact. And so, for example, with the U.S. government, they have the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, and they will actually give, I think, about $400,000. If you get a contract as a U.S. agency in a country, if it's a project that they accept, to help do development, like skills development. And so it's not a lot of money, but of course, because of the social mandate tied to many of these projects, it is definitely something of interest to governments. Okay? So this is where we are now at. A lot of information again. I'm not going to go back over everything. At the next session, I'll pull this back in again and tell you where you are. But what happens now is that at this juncture of the pre-feasibility, and in fact, just as a note, pre-feasibility and feasibility now are not necessarily separate stages, okay? They've kind of melded together. But I'm just putting it as a stop point to say that pre-feasibility is where you collect as much information as you can before having to put in the huge financial requirements of a full feasibility. And so that's how I'm defining pre-feasibility. And again, that idea stage, the project definition, the concept document, and the pre-feasibility really are going to be quite iterative. But I will say that once done your project definition and that's at a decent level, you then just automatically move into the concept document phase. That will go through many iterations, for example. But then once you've got sufficient to pull that document together, Then you can now start working on the pre-feasibility. So you're not necessarily going all the way back up, but what you're doing is within each stage, you are being iterative, okay? And so as you begin to pull this information together, again, you're gaining information that not only you need, but other people need in order to make a decision about your project. That's why it's important to be able to pull as much information together as soon as possible if you want to accelerate your project. So your assignment now, amongst the others that I've given in the past, is begin to pull together information on the country. This will help you if you've decided on one or two countries and you're looking to do many projects or several projects. Again, you're leveraging your time and effort by having that information. And wherever you can make connections with that country that you can use in the future. Good example is if you are in a large country like the US, the UK, France, you can talk to the embassy people and they will put you in contact with the different departments. Now, I will tell you, depending on the country and the embassy, you will get great service or you won't, you'll hardly get any service. But the point is, it doesn't hurt you to find out what they can provide before you even make a commitment to travel there for an extended time to work on finding a site or finding a local partner. Gather as much information as you can beforehand. Again, even your foreign service officers for your country who are in that country or in that region, they can help pull together information for you. Look at programs that your government has in the country. Doesn't have to be energy. It can be another sector. It can be a social or development program because oftentimes they have people on the ground. And you'll notice that certain aspects of those projects might actually require that they interface with the energy department, or if you're doing an agriculture department. So think outside the box about how you get the information, but I can guarantee you that you can probably get about 75% of your information without stepping in the country. In many countries, I won't say all of them, but probably 12 to 15 of them, you don't even have to step in the country to get the understanding that you need about how to start your navigation in the country. So that's your assignment for this week, and I hope that you have gained, some real insight to this and this process. Again, we're going to keep going through this, but I'm very excited to see that people are really getting something out of this. And so take care until next week. Again, these are the next steps. Once we finish this, you can go into the practicum. I won't stay on this slide. And the final thing is, if you need to contact me, please feel free to contact me, and by email, that's info@afribiz.org. And so now I'm going to sign off.